I moved from knowing about God, which is what I learned in Sunday school, to knowing God, which is a big
Mm,
difference.
okay.
You know, you can always tell two things about people where their priorities are, what they spend their time on and what they spend their money on. The thing for me that I really had to do some serious examination with is I had to come to grips with the idols of my life. And by idol, I mean anything that establishes your identity other than being God's beloved child.
Good afternoon and welcome to another episode of the Legacy Men's podcast here at the Depot at Cornerstone Church. My name is Gary Trevor, your host, and co-host Jason Gonzalez, and we are thrilled to have as guest Mark Lassiter.
Yep. Thank you very much for tuning in here at the Legacy Men's podcast, where we learn how to live and leave a godly legacy. Could you walk us through who we have here today?
Absolutely.
Gary, Mark?
So Mark Lassiter, a very esteemed lawyer from basically LA. I think you spent 20 years there and you spent another 15, 20 here in Arizona.
Yeah, 11 in LA and
Okay.
30 here in Phoenix.
Cool.
And I think we've got an exciting story this afternoon about his life, his ups and downs, but then his walk into Christ. So do me a favor. Tell us how your dad took you to a Billy Graham crusade in 68
Well, so the way that
and what age that was.
yeah, the way that I came to faith, I was raised in a Christian home. I mean, from 4 years old on, I can remember attending church with my family. And about the time I was in the sixth grade or 12 years old was when I really came to faith and understood what it meant to be a Christian and to accept Christ as my Lord, kind of a thing. And the way that came about is I was at home. It was after dinner. As I was wont to do, my brother and I were wrestling in the living room. And as it typically happened, he got hurt. And once he started crying, Mom told us to quit. So I quit, and I'm kind of bored. And I see my dad sitting there reading something on the couch. So I jump up next to him and said, "Hey, Dad, what you reading?" And I could tell I was kind of annoying him. He was working on something. He was very deliberate and intentional about whatever he was working on. And he said, "Well, I'm studying to be a counselor at an upcoming Billy Graham thing." This would have been in the late 60s in Los Angeles, about the time of the Watts riots, which were pretty big at the time. And I said, "Well, Dad, what are you reading?" And he said, "Well, this is a booklet. It's the 4 spiritual laws. I have to learn this in order to be a counselor at the Billy Graham concert or event." And I said, "Well, read it to me." And so he proceeded to read this book called The 4 Spiritual Laws, which was developed by Bill Bright of Campus Crusade for Christ. And he went through and he said, God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life. The thing that separates you from God is your sin. The person of Jesus bridges the gap, the chasm between you and your sin and God and his holiness. And if you accept Christ and the gift that he offers to you, you can join in fellowship with God. And then it shows you this thing and says, here's life without God, here's life with God, and in various things. And so he says, "Well, what do you want?" And I said, "Well, I want the life with God." And so he walks me through the sinner's prayer that's in the booklet. And then he gets up and walks in the kitchen to get something to eat. But that was a very real moment for me. I can remember just sitting there and having a physical sensation, like somebody had poured warm oil over my head and shoulders. I'd never had a sensation like that before. It was as real as taking a shower, kind of a thing. And at the same time, just having this weight lifted off of me. And I couldn't explain. It was a very, C.S. Lewis would call it a noumenal experience. It was an experience of the metaphysical, of the supernatural. And yet it was almost to me the introduction of, hey, there really is a God. It's not just something you read about. Mm-hmm. Something just touched me. And that sensation has followed me throughout my life at various times. I mean, it's not there every day or anything like that. But often when I pray for people, or often when I'm just kind of spontaneously moved by God's Spirit, it's often accompanied by that kind of sign or sensation. Yep. And that was how I came to faith when I was 12 years old.
Yeah, I think there's important for listeners in regards to just kind of what that relationship kind of looked like from that point, because beforehand it was the knowledge that you held and then the rules that you were following. And then there was kind of a shift from that. It was then, no, this is more about Christ.
Yeah, I moved from knowing about God, which is what I learned in Sunday school, to knowing God, which is a big difference.
Okay. Awesome. And then, so walk us through some of the teenage years you had out there in California. You were actually part of a Calvary Chapel, which if you guys haven't watched, Jesus Revolution is a lot about Calvary Chapel, and you got to experience some of that leadership out there.
I did. I came in kind of on the tail end of some of what you would have seen in the movie. So when I was growing up, I was kind of boring. I was a very straight-laced kid. I went to church my whole life. I was very active in sports. I was not a particularly good student because I didn't have any use for it, but I loved playing sports, and that was kind of my life. And but from a very young age, I became a reader. And about the time I was in junior high, I started going to these Maranatha music concerts. They were kind of contemporary Christian music at the time, really the beginning of the contemporary Christian music movement. And then I started attending Calvary Chapel in Costa Mesa. Now, I was also going to church every Sunday and at youth groups and stuff at my church at Rolling Hills Covenant. But on other times, I would kind of drive down on Sunday nights and go hear Chuck Smith or Greg Laurie or others talk at Calvary Chapel in Costa Mesa. And that really inspired me to just study and read the Bible a lot. So I did that a lot as a kid growing up, but I wasn't a party animal. I wasn't I was kind of a boring kid. Everybody on the bus when we're coming back from the basketball game is saying, what about this or that? I'm like, nah, I'm not going to go to that party. That's not my thing. So I got a lot of grief for it, but I didn't care.
Yeah. I think one of the unique things that you shared, and I love this about you because you're an extremely well-educated, law degrees, are not easy to get and all of that, right? But you ran your own practice. So you read the word in a different way to almost where you could retain it and regurgitate, I don't know how many different books you said verbatim. Can you?
Well, so one of the things we did every summer is we went up to Hume Lake Christian Camps up in the Sequoia Kings Canyon National Forest. And my dad and my brother and I would go on backpack trips up in the high Sierras. We typically leave for 7 to 10 days. And when we would hike, I had this pocket New Testament. And as we would hike, we go 10 or 12 miles a day. And I would just have that with me. And one by one, I would just memorize a verse. And then a half mile later, I'd do the next verse and stuff like that. And then I'd come back at the end of the night and repeat it. We didn't have mobile phones or any of those kind of distractions. And even if we did, you couldn't have got a signal where we were hiking and stuff. But I just used those as occasions during those summers of just memorizing stuff. And I was very intentional about it. I memorized a lot of the Bible, but I don't regret that. Yeah. But knowledge puffs up, and there's a sense, especially as a young Christian, that becoming a good Christian is becoming knowledgeable. But I don't really adhere. I don't disagree with that, but it's the wrong priority. And I came to understand that later in life, but it was kind of during midlife crises rather than that.
I love the principle of it because you talked about it's not just made to learn, but to obey. And I love that for listeners because, either you come across a lot of people that may know a lot of scripture, but they're not being obedient. And so it's hard to follow a Christian that's not actually living out their faith, right? But I love that you're able to identify with that, recognize that, as smart and intelligent as you can be, right? It's like you can learn it to a point where you can repeat it as much as possible, but not obeying it is completely. And it's amazing that you were able to actually do that later on in life. I wanted to go back to Rolling Hills because that's where you got to meet your wife.
Yeah. So well. I finished my undergrad at UCLA, and then I went to Loyola Law School in Los Angeles, and I had been practicing law for a couple of years, and I came out of a Sunday morning service. There was about 1,200 people in that service, and people were milling around in the foyer, and I saw a couple of friends of mine talking with some girl I'd never seen before, and so I kind of poked my way into the conversation, and that's where I met my wife. It's really funny. We only talked for 5 minutes the first time we met. And I made a mental note. I had to ask her out someday, but I didn't seize on the thing immediately. But my wife, who has this incredible sixth sense, it scares me, was walking to the car with her roommate, and she turned to her roommate and said, "You know that guy we just met?" And her roommate said, "You mean Mark?" And she goes, "Yeah." I'm going to marry him. Where do you want to go to lunch? It was like, it was
That's
this, it
crazy.
wasn't that she was
Wow.
like set her sights on this, like, oh, you know, I'm going to
Yeah.
scheme and connive to get this guy. It was more like she had this intuition.
Yeah.
And 9 months later, we got married. So anyway, that was me when I met her.
Yeah.
So then talk about you then spent, what, 11 years, how many years in LA?
I worked in LA doing business real estate and construction law for 11 years. And then I burned out. And so I moved to Arizona. It was actually 30 years ago next weekend on Memorial Day that we moved here. And I at first came here because of an interest in the emerging field of computer-aided evidence presentation and case management, which in the early 90s was radical. It was the ability to instantaneously retrieve and display to judges, juries, arbitrators, things like that, photos, full motion videos, documents, and then annotate them on the fly during the middle of a trial.
Wow.
And I became an expert in that by coming here to Arizona and joining the company that had developed that software. But later I ended up going back into private practice here and doing the same kind of stuff.
So then tell us about what happened 2007.
So the
it was-
transformation for me in my own journey is during the period of my career and kind of coming of age here into my career, I became a complete workaholic, and my entire identity was really tied into my status and standing as a professional in the legal community here. And I wouldn't have seen it at the time, or if somebody would have said that, I would have disputed it, but I would have been in denial. Because really, you know, you can always tell two things about people where their priorities are: what they spend their time on and what they spend their money on. And I was a workaholic, so I was at the office, 60 or more hours a week. And I was constantly developing continuing ed programs for lawyers. I was teaching lawyers. I was teaching judges the areas of law that I was good at. And I did that because I wanted my name in the community. If we would have had LinkedIn back then, we didn't. I would have been one of those sorry souls who would have ostensibly, posted myself and said, well, I'm pleased to be honored with this or that accolade. I no longer do that. But that was kind of like where I would have found my sense of identity. And I think God had other plans for me because it was around 2005 when the law firm that I founded just fell apart. And when it fell apart, so did I. I didn't know what to do without the appearance of being this successful lawyer. And success to me means you have a successful firm. But the firm that I had, while it was a good firm, the lawyers kind of left and went in other directions, and I kind of got left holding the bag, and it wasn't sufficient for me.
Yeah, and this is when the economy, something had happened to some of the businesses that...
Yeah, this was right before that. So this would have
Yeah.
been 2005. The economy went to hell in September of 2008. And so for me, it happened a little early, but what was nice about it when it didn't happen is I pivoted and I downsized my practice. I got out of the high overhead that I was in. I went into a very simple practice with greatly reduced overhead and expenses, and I completed that shift before the Great Recession hit, and
So-
it was a lifesaver.
Let's talk about before the shift. So I believe there were some companies that claimed bankruptcy that couldn't pay the practice, right? at
Well,
some
so
point,
one of
but-
the reasons our firm failed is
Yeah.
3 of our biggest clients, who were not my clients, they were
Yeah.
clients of a partner of mine in the firm.
Yeah.
He did the equivalent, he and a paralegal did the equivalent of about 2 years worth of legal work for them and didn't get paid.
Yeah.
And the way it was going, it was, frankly, we kind of all had this assumption that everybody's got their clients under control and stuff like that. So that came as a big shock to me. But when that happened, I just realized, they left and I stayed on, and I was trying to keep the whole ship afloat. But I was working 7 days a week, 12, 14 hours a day. I did that for like 120 days. And I was at complete burnout in my life.
Yeah. And your mother-in-law owned the building.
Yeah, she was the landlord, and this
Yeah.
was, the rent from that was paying for her retirement, so she could come and live near us and enjoy our, her grandkids, Betsy and my kids and stuff. And it was a big piece of humble pie for me to go back to her and say, I know you did a tax deferred exchange of your apartment building to move out here and buy this building. I can't be the tenant anymore because I can't keep up with the workload. I've got a building here that should have a lot of lawyers in it, and half of them have left, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And so that was a huge crisis, and it all kind of, it's funny, during that time I was attending a church, and I was such a wreck. I mean, I was eating fast food at 5 a.m. in the morning as I was going to work. I was eating fast food at 8 o'clock at night coming home. I was working 7 days a week during that stretch. I was not in any kind of community with my wife or with my kids. I made a token showing at church on Sundays and maybe care group on Wednesday night, but I was in depression. I was isolated. I just didn't know what to do. I was like in the ocean just trying to swim and keep my head above water in the middle of a typhoon. And it was during that time that we went to a care group. And my wife, I mean, God bless her, she knew I was just a wreck. And I wouldn't talk to her about it. I was too ashamed of what was going on. And so we get to this care group, and there's about a dozen couples from church, and we get there, and the host of the group, who are friends, and they're great people, but, they're all sitting there, and the wife is like, so who has prayer requests they'd like to share? And I remember just sitting there. I was so cynical about the whole thing, and I just thought to myself, oh, I can see what's going to happen now. Some poor sap, his wife is not going to be able to stand the silence following a question like that.
Yeah.
And after 30 or 45 seconds, she'll start elbowing her husband like, well, you need to say something. We can't stand the silence and stuff. So there's like complete silence for like a minute. And then I hear this voice over my left shoulder say, well, I think Mark has something he'd like to share. I turned and it was my wife.
Yeah.
And I just shot her one of those looks like, I can't believe you just betrayed me like that. And I turned around to the rest of the group and said, no, I'm fine. And everyone in the group knew that was a lie. They just knew that was a lie. And I knew it was a lie. But I didn't know to do anything different, and I didn't trust a lot of the people in that room to share anything about it. There were a few guys that if it would have just been me and those guys, I could have talked about it.
Yeah.
But I wasn't about to share it with people in the room that were kind of, gossipers or things like that around the church.
And this is around November time frame, and then December, Christmas happened.
Right, and
walk us through this.
Christmas of 2005, I had this meltdown. I woke up in the middle of the night, and I was stepped out of the master bedroom kind of a thing, and I had this realization. I mean, the way it came about is I've had this history of reading Christmas cards and letters on Christmas Day in the afternoon. So my wife compiles them all when they come in, and then after we open presents and the kids are out playing or something like that, I'll sit down and start reading the Christmas cards and letters. Well, I grew up in a very affluent neighborhood. I would not say that my family was affluent, but my dad made very good decisions as a middle-class guy, and so we ended up in a nice neighborhood. But I'm reading all of the Christmas cards from the people I went to high school and college with, and they're all in the top echelons of society. They've all gone to Ivy League schools and have great jobs. And you start reading these things, and it's like, oh, Bert got a promotion to CEO, and so did an IPO for his new company, and John won the Nobel Prize again. And I'm reading all these people who have these great, things going on in their life. And the more I read this, I'm thinking, my life totally sucks. There's nothing in my life right now that works. And as I kind of take this inventory on Christmas night, it was about 1 o'clock in the morning, I start crying. I'm like, I'm just a wreck. And the more I think about it, I'm like, I'm totally checkmated. There's no area of my life right now that is not headed over just over the abyss. Right there. My marriage is a wreck. I'm not talking or communicating with my wife. I hardly ever see my kids. I've gained all this weight. I'm eating poor choices for nutrition and stuff. I'm in debt up to my ears, all this other kind of stuff. And as I think about that, I start sobbing. And then something happened that never has happened before or since. I started wailing. And wailing, I don't even know how to begin. It's like you are crying, sobbing, and shouting at the same time, and you're doing it uncontrollably. And I remember consciously thinking at the time, oh my God, is this what it means to have a nervous breakdown? Is that what I'm having right now? And I couldn't stop. And I was afraid that the shouting was going to wake up the kids downstairs. And so I went back into the master bedroom where my wife was, and I shut the door behind her, and she woke up, and I was like, what is wrong with you? And I sat down with her, and I said, I am a failure at everything that's important to me in life. Everything. And I don't see a way out in any of them. I said, I'm not a good husband to you. I failed in all the promises I pledged and made to you when we got married. I just, and I'm not seeing the kids. I'm not investing in their life. The business is a wreck, etc. I don't know what to do. And that was the moment of realization where the denial was gone. I couldn't deny it anymore. I realized I've got to deal with some issues. And that kind of set me on a journey of liberation from a lot of things that were capturing me. You know, John writes, and he said, don't love the world or the things of the world, for if anybody loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that's in the world is the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. So here I am sitting in my custom home in a really nice subdivision, you know, the lust of the eyes, you know, acquiring possessions and everything was so important. The pride of life, having all the accolades and you know, the respect of my peers in the legal community, all of those things had become idols for me. And I just realized I just got to cast those things down. I reached a point where I said, there is nothing I would not be willing to sell, get rid of, change to get out of this situation. There's nothing I wouldn't be willing to do. And I told my wife that. I said, I don't want to live another day like this. If we have to sell our house and live in a tent trailer, I'd rather do that than what I'm going through right now. And she's like, okay. You know, she always had a very balanced kind of a perspective on things that I didn't have at that stage in my life.
And this is when you really started to change things. What's crazy is that God started to show you things that were already supposed to be part of the plan. And so you went to your mother-in-law, which was a conversation you were fearing to tell her that you were going to relinquish the
I went to her and
lease.
told her, I said, I can't pay the rent that I promised you. I said, I know the lease still has more unexpired period of the term of the lease. And she goes, you know, Mark, it's funny you'd say that because I am thinking of, I'd like to sell this building. And so she put it up for sale, and she sold it in early 2008 at the top of the market before Shearson Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy. And so it turned out, you know, God causes all things to work together for good to those who love him. And so that worked out really well, and I was able to pivot in the period before then and get my expenses down really low, and that helped, I think, survive the Great Recession period. But that was kind of the temporal side of things. The thing for me that I really had to do some serious examination with is I had to come to grips with the idols of my life. And by idol, I mean anything that establishes your identity other than being God's beloved child.
Amen.
And I had to come to grips with the fact that I was trying to find who I was in my career and my vocation. I actually, that was the time that about that time, I resigned from being a Republican and I became an independent. And the thing that informed that decision more than anything was I was reading a book by Brennan Manning called Abba's Child. And in that book, he talks about the fact, you know, if we're finding our identity in anything, whether it's our political party or our Rotary Club or anything like that, that's a form of idolatry. And I thought to myself, I've never thought of my political party affiliation as being a statement about my identity. But I look at a lot of people I know, and even friends, that find a lot of who they are. You know, it's an interesting question. You ask somebody, tell me who you are in, elevator speech. You got 30 seconds.
Yeah.
What do people say? How would you answer that question?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's taken a long time, but I'm at the point where I'm more and more, I think I can say, I'm God's beloved child.
Amen.
Mm-hmm.
And that's enough.
Yeah.
End of sentence.
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
Let's talk about your transformation and how impactful men's ministry ended up being in that, or just formulating a community with other men sharpening other men, iron sharpening iron, and what that did to your life.
Especially with Steve Sossaman.
Yeah. So my best friend, Steve Sossaman, was. It's funny, we were neighbors in Queen Creek in the community we were in, and he had 3 daughters, still does, that were very close in age to both my daughter and son. My daughter and them were just really close. They would come over all the time and go swimming and horseback riding and things like that. And because I had been so busy frenetically just trying to keep my head above water at work, I hadn't seen Steve for several months. And I ran into him kind of happenstance at a Starbucks. And I was there. I normally would not have been there in the afternoon. I was there, and I ran into him, and I'm like, hey, how are you doing? And we got to talking, and he asked me, he said, well, what are you doing these days? And I looked him straight in the eye, and I said, I'm tearing down idols. And he kind of laughed and said, what do you mean by that? And I kind of recounted to him the whole story I was just telling you. And he had a remarkable reaction to that. He goes, I've had my own story. And that would be his story to tell. Maybe he'll come here and talk to you guys about that sometime. But the bottom line is we both shared our stories. And it was not just sharing our stories about all of the things that, I got a promotion. I got that's not what I mean by the story. It was the story of here's what happened in my life. And I need to make some changes. And kind of admitting my failures, my weaknesses, what I've come to realize about myself that I don't like. And we both shared that. And we talked for 3 hours. It was a God incidence. I don't believe in coincidences. Mm-hmm. It was a God incidence. Amen. And I said to him after that, I go, you and me, we need to spend more time together. And so we started bike riding together. And we would just go cycling on these canals throughout the East Valley and talking about life and what was going on. And little by little, women began to notice our community together, just that we were laughing. And she started coming to Steve and me and saying, my husband's having a hard time right now at work, and he's going through some stuff. Would you guys mind just meeting and talking with him? And we'd say, well, do you have a bike? We'll get on it and come for a ride. And so we started doing that. And I mean, we got up.
And that was like a group that you guys formed. It's the Buzzard Bait Cyclists.
Yeah, the Buzzard Bait Cyclists. So this is our 18th year that we've been together. And we've had dozens and dozens of guys come and go. We probably have on the roster, I don't know, a couple of dozen people. And on any given weekend, 12 or so will show up or something. Yeah. But what that did is it cultivated and fostered a community and a camaraderie of men, most of whom are Christians, but not all, because we welcome anybody. And we talk openly about our life and faith and things like that and share that. But it's been transforming for the men that are in there. There are guys in that group that would tell you, I wouldn't be alive today if I hadn't have found that group. You may have one of those guys on your podcast coming up in the next few weeks. But what I learned in my weakness is that men, it was Henry David Thoreau that said, most men live lives of quiet desperation.
I agree.
That is a profound
observation.
And it was true of me, and it's true of almost every guy that's come into the wake of buzzards. That's what you call a flock of buzzards, is a wake. Every one of those guys came in burdened with marital problems or unemployment or a child that committed suicide or something like that. Yeah. And they find relief from their quiet desperation in a community of listening people who don't self-righteously judge or condemn them, but encourage them to tell their story and listen in a non-judgmental way and love them for who they are. That is a transforming thing in the life of a man, and it's the only antidote to a life of quiet desperation.
You used an expression of meekness, that men perceive meekness as a weakness, but it's power unto a powerful life.
Yeah, well, it was the interesting thing, you read in the Bible and it talks about Moses being meek, and I remember thinking, what does that word mean? Jesus said, blessed are the meek, they'll inherit the earth. And meek is not the same thing as weak. Meekness in the Greek was a term that was used when they would break a wild horse like a stallion. And it didn't mean that the wild horse lost its power or its stamina or its spirit. It just means that it brought itself into a place of discipline and submission to its master. So now the master could fashion for his purposes the power of that magnificent animal. And so I think meekness is one of the virtues that we do not put forward enough to men in the Christian community. It doesn't mean we all become wimps.
Oh, no.
But it does mean that we bridle or channel or discipline our strengths in a way that it is in service to the kingdom and to Christ.
Yeah.
I think a good word for it as well, which one of our previous guests talked about, I think it's a full surrender to Christ on a daily basis. That yes, I can do all kind of things, but I'm not going to do my way. I'm going to do your way.
Yeah.
So I like that fact and I think that's whenever we think about breaking a horse, we always think about breaking his spirit. But the way you just described it is so much better. They finally surrender to the trainer, but the power is still sustained to do what they've got to do.
Boy, if you want to
love
see
that.
the right way to break a horse, watch The Man from Snowy River. It is the greatest family movie ever. My grandson, who's 4 and 6, my grandsons come over. They've watched that thing 24 times in the last 4 months.
The Man from Snowy River?
It's
Okay,
a
cool.
great movie about
haven't seen
a
it.
boy-to-man experience, and one of the great family movies of all time.
I think one of the cool things, just to revert back to what that movie's trying to show, right, or display, is that the way that Jesus still had to corral the disciples in community, they were still, and I love the way that you described this, they were still building community and camaraderie based on some of the most difficult challenges that they had to face. And this is what happens, for a lot of you that don't know, listeners, Gary and I have a military type background, and this is what happens and fosters and breeds in the military, is that we become brothers because we're building tents, we're sleeping in the dirt, we're learning all these different things that are like mind and muscle memory, that these practices, the being tired together, blood, sweat, and tears together, like all of those things the disciples were going through. Right, the seeking of that adventure of learning from Christ, in those moments too. But they were still just men.
Yep.
Right.
And the interesting thing is when the heat was on in combat or battle, they forgot about all the petty grievances and resentments and stuff like that. Any one of those guys would take a bullet for anybody else. It didn't matter if they were black, white, Hispanic, whatever.
Yep.
When they're back in the hooch, they might congregate in flocks of races or whatever, but when the combat
Who gets
flared,
the last piece of pita?
That's right.
Right?
Exactly.
But I just thought it was really cool that you mentioned that, because I think there's a lot of men out there that listen to this that you've either come across, the right type of men that you can build that type of community with, but you might be doing it just slightly wrong, right? Beer and wings isn't everything, right? It's like that's just a fake, just surface level type relationship. You talk a lot about making men feel safe, providing that safety of other men being transparent so that you can actually start talking about the real things that are going on.
So here's a great analogy. You were saying that when you think of breaking a horse, there are ways to break a horse that just break its will. But one of my favorite things, it was made into a movie, but it was actually based upon a real guy. It was called The Horse Whisperer. And the Horse Whisperer would just get on his own horse and he'd take off and he'd find some stallion in the middle of nowhere that was a wild Mustang or something like that. And he could just ride next to this Mustang and put its ears back and it's bucking and trying to get away from me. And just the way that he kind of interacted with that horse without ever doing anything to like try to rope him or anything like that, he could coax and cajole in a loving way that animal to bend or submit to his will. Yeah. And what I've never self-described this way, but the way that we interact, I say we, I mean the veteran buzzards, because we are a group about cycling, but we are about mileage, not mileage. We subordinate things we'd like to do when the new guy comes on board to make sure he has a great experience and gets brought into the group. And we're very deliberate and intentional about that. But we've learned how to kind of interact with men in a way that invites them, without making them feel forced or something like that, to come into the group and to begin telling their story. Mm-hmm. And I think that is what Jesus did with the disciples. Yeah. I mean, think about it. Peter and James and John, they leave their family business and follow him. Mm-hmm. Yep. What the heck, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, how does that happen? There must have been something very charismatic and yet at the same time very gentle to persuade them to do that. And I think we as men in Christian communities need to find a way to just lovingly invite other people into our community and fellowship. Mm-hmm. There may be guys who will come to a men's event at a church that might not feel comfortable coming to church proper, at least not right away. But I think when men find a community where they feel safety, and by safety I mean whatever they say in the group stays in the group. Mm-hmm. They can talk about whatever they're struggling with and not feel that they're being judged or condemned. So safety, then you have to have camaraderie. You know, it's kind of the Cheers phenomenon. Everybody knows your name. You know, Norm walks into Cheers and everybody knows him. Yeah. Safety, camaraderie, and then finally you have to have adventure and activity. Men don't thrive sitting in chairs somewhere. No. They like to get out and hunt, fish, golf, play tennis, cycle, whatever else. Mm-hmm. And those three things make for those three things make for the ingredients of a good fellowship with men and building a place. You know, a lot of times the greatest conversations happen on the road trips going from one place to the next because men tell stories. They tell their stories in those moments. And they're really precious things to observe and behold.
We just appreciate your valuable insight and your time and your passion for men and the way that you just firstly love Christ and how you in time by God's grace self-corrected. And now you're back in this passionate role with your wife, with your kids, with these men. And friends of yours are friends of mine, and they give me accolades as long as I've been with the group about you and the impact in your life. So thank you for being the light of the world and the salt of the earth to help these men, because that's the whole reason we have a podcast, is simply to get the men off the edge in a safe place and have the hope through Jesus Christ. So thank you so much, Mark, for your valuable time today.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Jason. It's good to be with you guys.
Thank you. I just wanted to take the time to thank you, listeners and viewers, again, for joining us here at the Legacy Men's Podcast, where we learn how to live and leave a godly legacy. Mark is teaching us some ways to do that, and I think that the most important thing is that he's doing it through his authentic self.
Amen.
He's being just completely honest about what happened in his story, and that's something that as men, we don't typically do. We live at a surface level. So I'd encourage you to just open up those doors with the different men that you actually trust and have that safety with in your life, because it will allow for you to tell each other the true stories of your lives and where you're struggling, where you're thriving too, right? Even just seeking that adventure and having those activities, those two things can live in the same world. And so we'd encourage you to go find that sense of community in your wherever you're at, wherever you're listening. Thank you very much for tuning in.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Greatly appreciate it, sir.
Thank you, Jason.
Next time on the Legacy Men's Podcast.
Yeah, one thing I want to encourage them is, like it took me a while to realize it, so hopefully I can encourage some people, is that no matter what job you're doing, when the alarm clock goes off in the morning and you go to work, I want to encourage you that it's not just for a paycheck. You are in full-time ministry if you're a Jesus follower, and God will put you in positions, whoever you deal with, the people you work with, your clients, your coworkers, and He wants you to minister to them. And now, how you do that, you ask God, and you come up with some creative ways to do it, and He'll give it to you. He definitely will give it to you. So I want to encourage people that when they go to work, again, it's their might be their vocation, but their real calling is ministry, and that's to make God's name famous and renowned for His glory.
Praise God.